Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in Cuba. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll be fully aware that Cuba is currently in the middle of an economic crisis. And this economic crisis has been going on for a number of years, but it's continuing to get worse. And one of the fundamental problems that Cuba has is that a lot of its infrastructure is reliant upon oil, as a result of the fact that Cuba was very close to Russia throughout the whole of the Cold War period in the 60s, 70s and 80s. A lot of the electricity infrastructure was built to be using oil, and therefore the power stations need a huge amount of oil to keep them running. Cuba doesn't have cash to be able to keep buying in that oil because Russia and Venezuela are no longer providing it with the volumes that they were providing it with historically. And as a result of that, Cuba is now having daily blackouts. It's telling all of the residents that power will be out for long periods of the day. And obviously that means it becomes very difficult if you're a business in Cuba to be productive if you're having to shut down your factory or your operation for long periods of each day and each week. So Cuba really needs some help at the moment. And one of the things that we're seeing right now is that China and Russia are prepared to offer some help to Cuba. And so Cuba is now cozying up to both of those nations. And in today's video, I want to show you some footage of 4 warships that have been sent by Russia to Havana. Now, obviously, the issue with that is that Cuba is only around 100 miles away from the southern tip of Florida. So from the USA's point of view, they're concerned that if Cuba does get closer to Russia and Russia starts to send some of its military over to the island, that we could have some sort of incident similar to what we saw in the Bay of Pigs back in the 1960s, when the USA was concerned that Russia was planning to build nuclear bases on the island. So in today's video, I'll have a look at that footage and talk about why Russia have sent these warships at this point in time. And I don't think it's any coincidence that it comes very shortly after the USA recently signed off on Ukraine using its weapons in the war in Ukraine. We'll also talk about what's going on with tourism, because tourism historically was a big source of income from Cuba's point of view. It's a Caribbean island, it has nice beaches, it's a quaint place to go. A lot of the buildings are very attractive, and they do have this fleet of old USA vehicles that I think are very popular with tourists. However, the COVID-19 pandemic and the subsequent sanctions that were reimposed against Cuba by President Trump have had a devastating impact on the tourism industry and the amount of money that Cuba's earning from that. So we'll go through some of the details, have a look at the latest figures. We'll also talk about the shortages that are ongoing with regards to food and medicine and other supplies for Cuban nationals. On the positive side, we'll talk about what's going on with small businesses, because Cuba has now allowed an element of capitalism into the economy. So we'll talk about what's going on with that, and there has been actually some positive developments in terms of the USA's involvement in those small businesses. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is likely to happen for Cuba over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've sent me a YouTube super thanks or bought me a coffee recently, thank you for the time and effort you've taken to do that. Really, really appreciate it. And if you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and watch them advert-free, or YouTube membership, where you'll also get early access, or buy me a coffee membership, thank you for that support. It really does help to keep me motivated, keeps me going, and keeps me thinking up more ideas for videos. So thanks.
A nuclear-powered Russian submarine and 3 Russian ships arrived in Cuba today. What are these warships doing so close to the United States?
Having passed just 30 miles off Florida, a 4-ship Russian flotilla pulled into Havana today, led by a warship and a submarine, both armed with guided missiles, and greeted by a 21-gun salute.
The Russian Defense Ministry says the strike group, including a nuclear-powered submarine, the Kazan, armed with modern caliber cruise missiles, is practicing the use of high-precision weapons. But it's really about Putin flexing his muscles on the international stage. Led by the flagship of Russia's northern fleet, the Admiral Gorshkov, which Russia's defense ministry says is normally equipped with latest Zircon hypersonic missiles, This is meant to deliver a powerful message to Washington.
It's not the first time Russian warships have pulled into Cuba, but U.S. officials say this appears intended by Vladimir Putin as a high-profile response to the Biden administration's support for Ukraine. The frigate has been used in the past to test one of Russia's newest hypersonic missiles. 2 American destroyers plus 2 ships specially equipped with sonar for tracking the submarine, along with Navy patrol planes, even sail drones, shadowed the Russian flotilla as it made its way across the Atlantic into the Caribbean.
Russian state television has been celebrating the naval deployment, placing some of Russia's most powerful vessels in Cuban waters. The American media has been discussing the event, reports the Russian news anchor, claiming the Pentagon has no idea where our submarine is positioned. In fact, US officials are downplaying any threat, but Moscow has been signaling displeasure at Washington recently green-lighting Ukrainian attacks on Russian territory with US-supplied weapons. Speaking ahead of the Cuba naval visit, Vladimir Putin warned of a possible Russian response.
If they in the West supply weapons to the zone of combat operations and call for the use of these weapons against our territory, then why do we not have the right to do the same, to mirror these actions? I'm not ready to say that we will do it tomorrow, but we, of course, should think about it.
Last week, Cuba said the visit was standard practice by naval vessels from countries friendly to Havana. The U.S. has been monitoring the Russian vessels as they skirted the nearby Florida coast. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan told reporters that such naval exercises were routine.
The visiting Russian warships to Cuba are Vladimir Putin's way of reminding President Biden that Moscow can challenge Washington in its own sphere of influence, too. This geopolitical alignment has echoes of the Cold War, but unlike the first Cold War, the Cubans are drawn to Moscow now, not by any ideological affinity, but by economic necessity. Cuba is in a desperate economic situation, and Russia is the only country that has been willing to provide significant help, just as it did during the Soviet era.
The stopover coincides with Cuba's worst social and economic crisis in decades, with shortages of everything from food, medicine, and fuel, and growing discontent on the streets. According to Russia's defense ministry, the 4 Russian vessels sailed to the communist-run country on Wednesday after conducting high-precision missile weapons training in the Atlantic Ocean. Cuba's foreign ministry said the fleet carried no nuclear weapons, something echoed by U.S. officials. Curious locals, fishermen, and police looked on.
The Russian ships are expected to remain in Havana until next week before getting underway again, perhaps for Venezuela. When they do, officials say, the U.S. Navy will start shadowing them again.
Elsewhere, Moscow has been stepping up tactical nuclear drills too, staging exercises with neighbouring Belarus near the Ukrainian border. Russian tactical nukes, delivered from either ground or air, can level entire cities, although the Kremlin insists it has no plans at this stage to use them.
As I mentioned at the start of today's video, historically, tourism has been a really big industry from Cuba's perspective. It's a Caribbean island, it's a pleasant place to go, and a lot of holidaymakers from around the world used to visit Cuba on a regular basis. This table shows a breakdown of the tourist figures for 2018 and 2019. And the reason that I've chosen to use these figures are that these 2 years were before the COVID-19 pandemic, which struck the world in 2020 and had a hugely negative impact on tourism globally. And what this data shows is that over 4.7 million people visited Cuba in 2018, and almost 4.3 million tourists visited in 2019. And in terms of the breakdown of where those tourists came from, the biggest single source of visitors is Canada, and in 2019, over 1.1 million Canadians holidayed in Cuba. The second biggest single group of tourists were Cubans who are living abroad, so basically Cuban nationals who are now working overseas and sending money back to their families. They return to Cuba on an annual basis for a holiday. Interestingly, in 2019, the third biggest source of tourism was the USA, and almost 500,000 Americans holidayed in Cuba. The fourth biggest source of tourism was Russia, and almost 177,000 Russians went on holiday to Cuba, followed closely by Germany, France, Mexico, Spain, Italy and the United Kingdom. Now, unfortunately, from Cuba's point of view, two major things happened in 2020 and 2021 that had a devastating impact on its tourist industry. Firstly, the COVID-19 pandemic spread all around the world at the start of 2020. And what this meant is that a lot of countries went into lockdown, nobody was allowed to travel, and as a result of that, tourism globally was heavily impacted, and Cuba, which was dependent on tourism, obviously bore the brunt of that pandemic. And in addition to that, on the 12th of January 2021, Donald Trump, as part of his exit process as being president of the USA, implemented new sanctions against Cuba. On the 12th of January 2021, the US Department of State designated Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. The Secretary determined that the Cuban government repeatedly provided supports for acts of international terrorism in granting safe harbor to terrorists. Cuba was previously designated as a state sponsor of terrorism in 1982 because of its long history of providing advice, safe haven, communications, training and financial support to guerrilla groups and individual terrorists. However, Cuba's designation was rescinded in 2015 after a thorough review found that Cuba met the statutory criteria for accession. But in 2021, the Secretary of State determined that Cuba had repeatedly provided support for acts of international terrorism since its state sponsor of terrorism designation had been rescinded in 2015. Citing peace negotiation protocols, Cuba refused Colombia's request to extradite 10 ELN leaders living in Havana after that group claimed responsibility for the 2019 bombings of a Bogotá police academy that killed 22 people and injured 87 others. Also, the Cuban government did not formally respond to the extradition requests for ELN leaders filed by Colombia. Cuba also harbours several US fugitives from justice wanted on charges related to political violence, many of whom have resided in Cuba for decades. For example, the Cuban regime refused to return Joan Chesimard, a fugitive on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list, who was convicted of murdering New York State Trooper Werner Forster. Cuba also refused to return William Morales, a fugitive bomb maker for the Armed Forces for National Liberation, who is wanted by the FBI and escaped detention after his conviction on charges related to domestic terrorism. Ismail Labit, who received 8 life sentences after being convicted of killing 8 persons in the US Virgin Islands in 1972 and hijacking a plane to Cuba in 1984. Charles Lee Hill, who's been charged with killing New Mexico State policeman Robert Rosenblum in 1971, Ambrose Henry Montfort, who used a bomb threat to hijack a passenger aircraft and fly to Cuba in 1983, and Victor Manuel Guerrena, a Puerto Rican militant who stole $7 million in a bank heist. Now, as a direct result of these new sanctions that were introduced at the start of 2021 by the USA, it is no longer possible for holidaymakers who visit Cuba to use what is known as an ESTA to enter the USA. So when you want to go to the USA, historically you had to apply for a visa, and this was quite a long-winded process because you had to take your passport down to your local USA embassy, queue outside for many hours, then submit your application, and then the embassy would hold on to your passport for a period of up to 2 weeks before issuing you with a visa. Now, in order to make it easier for people to actually holiday and go on business to the USA introduced a new system called the Electronic System for Travel Authorization, also known as ESTA. And basically what this is an online application that you submit, and once it's approved, it will last you for 2 years. So that means that once you have your ESTA, you can travel backwards and forwards to the USA for no longer than 90 days at a time. So it is much easier today to go to the USA on holiday or on business. However, if you've been to Cuba since the 12th of January 2021, you're no longer eligible to apply for ESTA, and so you have to go back to the old-fashioned system of taking your passport down to the US Embassy. They hold on to it, and then you have to wait for a couple of weeks, and you might get approved or you might not get approved. And this is now proving a problem from Cuba's point of view because it's deterring a lot of people from going on holiday to Cuba, because I don't think anybody really understands the system, and there's a message out there on the internet that if you go to Cuba, you won't be allowed into the USA. That's not actually true. You will be allowed into the USA, it's just a lot more hassle to actually go through the process. This chart shows the total number of visitors to Cuba in 2022 and 2023. And as you can see, in 2022, the total number was 1.6 million, and in 2023, it was 2.4 million. And just to remind you, in 2018 and 2019, the visitor numbers were 4.7 million and 4.3 million. And if we look at the breakdown of where those visitors are coming from, you can see that Canada is still the country that's providing the most tourists. Around 38% of all visitors in 23 came from Canada. The second largest group is now Cubans living abroad, around 15% of the total number of visitors in 23. And the third largest group is now Russia, and in 2023 around 185,000 Russians visited Cuba. And it's really interesting to note that the fourth largest group is the USA. So there are quite a large number of people from the USA who are still prepared to go to Cuba despite the fact that these new sanctions have been put into place.
The latest sanctions are another blow to the Cuban economy, already under U.S. embargo for the past 60 years. In a country where the state finances practically every sector of the economy, citizens can't get access to petrol and even medicine.
Cuba is a net importer. It doesn't have huge reserves of capital or other things that people want to buy, and therefore it's struggling to be able to afford to buy in all of the things it needs to import. And the main things are fuel to run electricity in the country and also to provide its residents with gasoline to run their vehicles, and food in order to keep everybody fed. And there are now serious shortages in Cuba. And as a result of this, people are struggling despite the fact that there is a ration card system. So a lot of the residents in Cuba qualify for free distributions of food. But unfortunately, the state simply doesn't have enough food to be able to give out.
A state-run corner shop where basic goods such as flour and oil are sold.
Today they have sugar.
In his hand, he holds a libreta, or ration card. This system, established after the revolution, enables citizens to receive subsidized food and supplies.
This is from last year. There was a lot more. Rice, sugar, beans, butter. We used to have it all. Now there's not much. There's only this. A pound of rice used to cost 5 Cuban pesos. Now it's 200. Many go abroad to the United States to send their pay back to their families.
As a result of the ongoing economic crisis, the Cuban authorities have had to relax their communist beliefs and allow some of the residents of Cuba to actually start up their own businesses. So what we're seeing is the element of capitalism now being introduced into the Cuban economy. And this is really a needs-must situation. The people of Cuba want to do something about their own position. They want to start working, they want to start earning money and being able to buy things.
No longer willing to wait for the state's support, some have turned to the emerging private sector. Like this store. Its well-stocked shelves are filled with products imported from Europe and Mexico, sold at top peso.
That's 4,500 pesos, almost 20 euros.
Is that a lot?
If a state worker buys this, they can't buy anything else all month. For example, I was a nurse. I loved my job, but here I earn my old monthly salary in 2 days, and now I can afford all these products.
But isn't that capitalism?
No. It's socialism evolving.
So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because the crisis in Cuba isn't going away anytime soon. There is a major problem going on in the country right now. There are shortages of fuel and electricity and food and healthcare and basically anything that you can think of. There are shortages in Cuba right now. And one of the reasons for this is because the country is completely bankrupt. It doesn't have enough money to be able to buy in all of the essentials that it needs to keep its population happy. And so as a result of this, Cuba is now having to reach out to countries that are prepared to help it. Now, as we know, the USA has placed sanctions against Cuba. There are multiple embargoes in place against Cuban goods. And so the USA, who's the closest neighbour, the closest, largest rich country that could help Cuba, doesn't want to reach out and do anything for Cuba. And so Cuba is having to turn to its long-standing relationships. And its most long-standing relationship is with Russia. And as we saw in today's video, Russia is getting closer to Cuba, so it has been sending quantities of oil and food and other items over the past year or so. But the trade-off for that is that Cuba is now happy to accept warships from Russia. Now, as we saw in the video earlier, Cuba has gone to great lengths to say that those ships and the submarine aren't carrying any nuclear weapons, so there is no threat to the USA. But I think what we're seeing here is President Putin from Russia sending a message to the USA, a reminder, a wake-up call that as it gets closer to Cuba, it has access to the island, and therefore, theoretically, it could start sending warships and weapons and other things that might start to worry the USA. Now, the USA is keeping a very close eye on this situation, but I think it's just a reflection of the relationship. Cuba is absolutely desperate. It needs somebody to come along and give it lots and lots of things. And Russia is prepared to hand over things that Cuba needs. And as a result of that, Cuba is happy to do what Russia wants. So the USA is really going to act as the policeman in this arrangement. It's going to keep a very close eye on what Russia is doing to make sure that nothing untoward is going on that's going to worry the USA in the long term. But I think the fact of the matter is that Cuba needs help. China and Russia are the two most obvious sources of that help. So they're going to get closer to Cuba over the course of the next 6 to 12 months. That may help to solve some of the economic problems in the country. But from a political and geopolitics perspective, it does come with some risks. The USA may not be happy that China and Russia are getting involved in Cuba, but in the absence of any other form of help, Cuba doesn't really have much choice. It needs to save its people, it needs aid, it needs support, and that support is now starting to come from Russia and China, and so we're going to see this alliance becoming stronger as we go forward. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.
Ready, set, ready, set, oh, that's a high one. Ready, ready, set, ready, set, ready, set.